Good evening. My name is Shanna O'Toole. I am the founder of Clause 40 Foundation, a nonpartisan nonprofit named after the part of Magna Carta in which the promise of due process first appeared in document form. I'm also the founder of its sister organization, Due Process Institute. We believe that the erosion of procedural due process rights is preventing the advancement of this country and all of its people. Therefore, it is our mission to rebalance the nation's criminal legal system by preserving, restoring, and honoring the due process rights guaranteed in our Constitution through public education, events, research, litigation, and advocacy. Thank you for joining us for part 6 of our series on transforming prosecution. Tonight, we are exploring how to transform the federal legal system. We continue our series with a new episode and a new panel every Sunday night until our finale on May 16th, when transformational prosecutors Larry Krasner, Jose Garza, and Barissa Dagani-Tafti join us for an intimate discussion regarding their triumphs and their ongoing challenges. And now I have the pleasure of introducing our guests. We are thrilled to be joined by Inimai Chettiar. Inimai is the Federal Director for the Justice Action Network. Prior to joining the coalition, Inimai directed the Justice Program at the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU School of Law. She also launched Law Enforcement Leaders to Reduce Crime and Incarceration, the first effort to organize police and prosecutors to join the justice reform movement. Prior to the Brennan Center, Inimai worked at the ACLU, served as a fellow at the Center for American Progress, and worked as a litigator at Debevoise and Plimpton. We're also very lucky to have Aamra Ahmad, who is currently Senior Policy Counsel for the Justice Division of the ACLU, where she advocates for federal criminal justice reform. Prior to joining the ACLU, she worked on the Sentencing Resource Council project. She also served as legislative counsel to Representative Bobby Scott from Virginia and is an assistant federal public defender for many years. We are also joined by Kevin Ring. Kevin became president of FAMM in January 2017, taking over the reins from founder Julie Stewart. Prior to joining FAMM, Kevin was a highly regarded lobbyist in Washington, D.C. He was also indicted in September 2008 on public corruption charges. After 2 trials and appeals, Kevin ultimately served 20 months in federal prison. I have known Kevin for over a decade, and I can't think of someone who spends more of his waking hours worrying about the people on the other side of a prison fence than he does. And the successes of FAMM are an illustration of Kevin's unwavering commitment. We're also very lucky to have Jason Pai moderating tonight's discussion. Jason is Director of Rule of Law Initiatives at our 501c4 sister organization, Due Process Institute, where he leads numerous legislative campaigns on Capitol Hill to improve the federal criminal legal system. Prior to joining Due Process Institute, Jason served as Vice President of Legislative Affairs for FreedomWorks. Jason is a bulldog. Jason is a fighter. Jason is learning to be a diplomat. In short, he is a relentless advocate for criminal legal reform, and I am honored and humbled to be able to call him my colleague at Due Process Institute. Inimai, Aamra, Kevin, Jason, let's have some real talk this Sunday evening.
Thank you, Shanna, and thank you to each one of our panelists for joining this evening. It's really great to see everyone. The opening of the episode sets the tone for so much of what's been going on in this docuseries. You see a small plane flying with a banner behind it that says, "New DA wanted in Philly, call FOP Lodge number 5. In an earlier episode, you see Krasner and his reform-minded team get a lot of internal pushback from the, quote, old guard prosecutors who were working in the office before Krasner. We've also seen some of the judges in Philadelphia pushing back on Krasner's new approaches on bail, etc. Throughout the course of the series, we've seen actors inside the system being antagonistic towards Krasner's reformer approach. Why do each of you think there is so much resistance from the actors inside the system? Don't they want the most efficient, most fair, most effective criminal legal system as well? So are reformers like Krasner wrong about what would make a better system, or is there something else that explains all this resistance? Let's start with you, Aamra.
Thank you, Jason. Thank you for having me here today to participate in this discussion. You know, I think that all of the actors depicted in the show are passionate and that they do care about having a just system and having effective system. But I also think that there's a lot of misinformation out there, and honestly, the American public and even actors who participate in the system sometimes, like judges and law enforcement, don't know the extent of the injustices in our system or how ineffective our system is. And I think that the cause for the resistance is this lock them up, tough on crime approach or way of doing things that's so ingrained now in American culture. There are stakeholders who can't imagine doing it any other way. One of Larry Krasner's aides actually calls it a gut-driven reaction to lock people up. And the public, as well as actors in the system, are just convinced that that's the best way to achieve public safety. But I think Larry Krasner does have it right. I think that there are problems with our system. The lock 'em up approach has resulted in mass incarceration around our country in the federal system, and we see it very plainly in Philadelphia. And there are racial disparities in the system that are really disturbing. So I think that Larry Krasner has it right, at least in that he wants to reform the system and that the system needs reforming.
Inimai?
Yeah, I completely agree with everything that Aamra said. I would just add the point that, you know, even though we do know that what DA Krasner is saying is what science and evidence and research and decades of mistaken policy show that what he's doing is correct, the issue of crime and criminal justice is so inherently political that I think it makes it hard for people to focus on the research, since the issue's been so politicized and used in political ads. And there's so much misinformation, as Aamra said, that's just been spread about what works to reduce crime.
Kevin?
Yeah, I think Krasner is largely right. And I think the pushback is natural and should be expected. You know, I mean, as Aamra said, I think all these system actors want the best outcomes. They may have different thoughts on how to achieve it. But our system of government is based on checks and balances and creating a system where, you know, the best solution arises from those, from that sort of opposing powers. And you know, I mean, I think defense attorneys want justice. I think prosecutors want justice. They're on opposite sides. You have an independent judge. All of these people are trying to create a system that creates justice. And in Krasner's case, you see it all the time with things like, I would bring these cases, but the police aren't collecting enough evidence. The police say, we're bringing in cases. He's not. I think those are totally natural things. And I think he is unlike anything the system has seen before. And so there's going to be some natural reaction. But that reaction may soften what are some extreme edges where maybe he doesn't know. I mean, he hasn't been a prosecutor before. You do learn things when you take a different job. You know, you and I worked on Capitol Hill. Every backbencher thinks they'd be the best Speaker of the House. And then they become Speaker of the House and they're like, I got to get 218 votes. And their job changes, right? And so he was a defense attorney. Now he's a prosecutor. He probably has some, you know, gained some respect for what the other side goes through. Now, clearly hasn't changed his views, and that's good. But I think this give and take is a good thing. I don't think we're going to have revolution of a system. I think we're going to have incremental change. And to the extent that he explains what he's trying to do, I think he wins converts and changes the system that way.
So Krasner believes that prosecution and law enforcement shouldn't be focusing on people who grapple with drug addiction. He says that multiple times throughout the course of the docuseries. Instead, he believes that those resources should target high-level drug dealers or traffickers, as well as violent crimes. That's why his office says it isn't prosecuting simple possession of marijuana, for example. It's why he's trying to get his assistant DAs not to seek cash bail for these sorts of offenses. His office uses accelerated rehabilitation disposition to try to divert people involved in drug offenses away from incarceration. All of us are reform advocates whose work focuses a lot on federal reform efforts. You know, how much of that do you think the problems you see with our federal criminal legal system are caused by the system focusing on drug use and drug addiction as a crime rather than a social or a health concern? After all, addiction is a health issue. And we'll start with Inimai.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that's absolutely right. There has been way too much focus on drug crimes. To put things in perspective, so as of June 2020, there were roughly 145,000 people incarcerated at the federal level serving time for a conviction. Of that number, 68,000 were there for drug offenses, and that's 40,000 more than the next category of convictions. So clearly there is a large focus on drugs. One thing that is heartening at the federal level is that there does seem to be a move away from focusing on drug crimes and trying to ease up on historically harsh convictions. So we saw the Fair Sentencing Act, which reduced the disparity between crack offenses and powder cocaine offenses. We saw the First Step Act that also reduced some drug offense sentences as well. So I do think that there has been a move, and it is bipartisan, to move away from this very strong focus on drug offenses.
Aamra?
Sure, I agree with everything that Inimai has said. To point out that most of the people, or a large number of people who are incarcerated in the federal system, are there for drugs. I also think it's important to understand that our system is based on the war on drugs model. And as is pointed out in this episode, and as you said, Jason, we treat drug use and drug addiction as a crime, and we lock people up for decades for it. The sentencing scheme at the federal level, its origin goes back into the 1990s when Congress enacted mandatory minimum sentencing laws for people who they thought they were targeting them at drug kingpins, at people who were at the top of the ladder. People importing large quantities of drugs and moving large quantities of drugs into communities. But what happens in practice, and we see this in Philadelphia as well as at the federal level, is that prosecutors and police go after low-hanging fruit. It's simply easier. It's a problem that is readily apparent, and they're easier targets. The problem is that the people who get these high mandatory minimum sentences, being at the lowest rung of the drug distribution ladder, being street level dealers or couriers, are just feeding their own addiction, and that effort at prosecuting them really doesn't cut off the supply chain. So, understanding that sentencing structure is important, and there are a number of proposals in Congress right now that some of them are gaining bipartisan support. Inimai mentioned the history of the Fair Sentencing Act, the First Step Act, which was signed into law by President Trump in 2018. And we should continue that effort and continue on that trajectory. The proposals that I'm thinking of are ones that would reduce mandatory minimum sentences. They wouldn't repeal them. That's something that organizations like mine would like to see, a total end to mandatory minimum sentencing so that judges have more discretion and can impose a sentence based on the individual circumstances of a case. But those are a step in the right direction.
And Kevin, do you want to give us some sense?
Yeah, I'd largely agree with that, but I can't stand to have total agreement. So let me just say, I was in federal prison for 16 months and probably met 300, 400 guys. There were some addicts. Most were not addicts. There were some people brought in strung out. Most people there were selling drugs to make money. They weren't addicted to drugs. They were more like white collar businessmen who committed fraud or just got caught selling an illegal product. They wanted a better lifestyle. I mean, there were teachers, other people who, weren't making a lot of money and they wanted to make more money and they sold drugs. So I just don't want people to think that if it were just addicts, that somehow that would really greatly reduce the federal prison population. They're more at the state level, sure. But, to get into federal prison, usually, at least now, 30 years ago, this was different. It's not it's not mostly addicts. But I think, it's not just drugs, right? Drugs affect violent behavior, especially like alcohol, which we don't really even talk about that much. People commit a lot of crimes because they're on drugs, violent crimes because they're on drugs, alcohol because they're on drugs, domestic violence, shootings. Most people are on some sort of drug when they commit these crimes. So we have to think differently about drugs overall and how we're going to deal with that. I mean, DUI is, for example, of like, we don't know what to do with it. Somebody kills somebody, but they're drunk. How culpable are they? I think the same is true for a lot of other violent crimes. So I think we're evolving on drugs. If you look at what's happening around the country, you're starting to see states decriminalize at least marijuana or legalize it. Oregon decriminalized all, possession, small possession. I think we're moving in that direction, but I think we have to look more closely at how drugs intersect with even more serious crimes, and how we're going to treat it, how we're going to treat them along those lines, because that's where we get the more serious sentences, right? I mean, if we talk, I know we're going to talk later about some of the federal reforms that are going on. If we're going to address long prison sentences, you're going to have to deal with people who are committing crimes, because they're on drugs. Drug crimes themselves, I think we're getting there. We're not, we have a long way to go, but I just don't want people to think if we just got rid of addicts, there are people who sell drugs to feed their addiction, but there's a lot of people who are just selling because they want to make money just like other people.
Anyone want to respond to Kevin, or if not, I have plenty of other questions. Aamra, you mentioned mandatory minimum sentences, and I know that we're all focused on various pieces of legislation currently in this Congress, and one of those is the Equal Act, and I know that bill has been a big focus of the Due Process Institute and our federal lobbying efforts. So, Kevin, I know FAMM is heavily engaged on the Equal Act. So why don't you tell us what that is and what it does and what the hope is?
Sure. First, I want to say, like Aamra, FAMM supports the elimination of federal mandatory minimum sentences for all crimes, not just drug crimes, but all crimes. We think judges should have discretion to give individualized sentences. In fact, the more serious offenses deserve more individualized treatment. That's where you really get the greatest gap between culpability and the sentence. But the Equal Act seeks to eliminate once and for all the disparity between crack and powder cocaine sentencing. It was infamously 100-to-1 created in 1986. And, this has led to a generation of Black men mostly being locked up for incredibly long sentences. And even though people saw its impact almost immediately, it took a long time to fix it. There were lots of proposals over the years, but finally in 2010, Congress reduced disparity from 100-to-1 to 18-to-1. So there's still some unequal treatment. They didn't make that retroactive. So that was really frustrating because a lot of the stories we had told at that time to get the law changed, those people didn't benefit. So that was a bitter pill. Fortunately, in 2018, Congress passed the First Step Act. It made the 18-to-1 retroactive. And now I think people are saying, and I mean, our view on this was, especially in the wake of last summer with the George Floyd, with the racial protests, that this isn't the biggest change in the world. But if you are looking to match both criminal justice reform and racial justice, this is the most obnoxious vestige of racism in the criminal code, right? There's a lot of implicit bias. There's a lot of, bad actors doing things that are hard to police. This is in the code. We all know there's no good reason for the disparity. And so we just want to see it eliminated.
Yeah, Inimai, I know you've been working on this as well. And you mentioned in your initial comments that there's been some bipartisan support for this. Can you tell us a little about the efforts, the movement we're seeing on Capitol Hill to get members on board with the Equal Act?
Yeah, as Kevin pointed out, this is one of the largest, if not the largest, racial disparity left on federal statute. So what I find really interesting and heartening about this is that there is so much bipartisan support. So, I mean, probably every single criminal justice advocacy group from the left and the right support this. So you have, the ACLU, NAACP, American Conservative Union, all the groups on this event. There is just such widespread support. There's also a tremendous amount of law enforcement support, which even a few years ago, I would have just been shocked by if someone told me that the National District Attorneys Association or the Major City Chiefs Association was going to sign on to something like this. I mean, I think that actually is pretty earth-shattering. So, I mean, that it's been very heartening to see this much support. And there are a whole slew of Republicans who are on board with the House version of this bill. So we have Kelly Armstrong from North Dakota, you have Don Bacon from Nebraska, Nancy Mace from South Carolina. There are just so many. I mean, the list goes on and on. So, I mean, I do think that the Equal Act is probably the bill that is poised to be able to move this year at the federal level.
And Aamra, what so in addition to the Equal Act, you know, what else is out there in the justice reform space that we should be watching out for as advocates at the federal level? What should we know about? What should the folks watching this at home know about that they can monitor on the Hill?
Sure. Well, there's the Smarter Sentencing Act, which has been introduced in the Senate, and that's a bill that reduces the 3 of the base mandatory minimums for drug crimes. It cuts those mandatory minimums in half. And significantly, it makes those changes retroactive. The Equal Act also makes the changes that it makes to the crack laws retroactive. And that's important so that people who were sentenced prior to enactment of the law aren't treated any differently than people who are sentenced the day after the law is passed. There's also the First Step Implementation Act. Both First Step Implementation Act and Smarter Sentencing Act have been introduced by Senator Durbin on the Senate side. And the First Step Implementation Act makes retroactive the laws, the sentencing laws that were enacted by President Trump in 2018 in the First Step Act. Again, that retroactivity is important so that there is fairness amongst people who are incarcerated, regardless of the date of their sentencing hearing. Something that's not in Congress, something that can be done by the executive is using the clemency power, of course, to achieve all of these changes, to address any sentences from prior to the First Step Act and prior to the Fair Sentencing Act that are inconsistent with sentences today. President Biden could do that immediately by starting a clemency process to review those cases and start reducing those sentences.
One thing that I didn't have written down as a potential question, but I do think it's worth bringing up here is the Olc Memo that the administration, the Trump administration, put out last year that the current administration has not rescinded yet. Does anybody want to take a moment to speak to that and explain to folks watching what exactly that is and how it's potentially problematic for people who have been allowed to essentially go home because of COVID-19 and may have to return to prison? Anyone want to take a crack at that?
Yeah, I'll take the first whack at it, but I know Inimai and Aamra are working on this as well. Congress passed the CARES Act in March 2000 to give assistance to businesses and individuals, but included in that legislation was language authorizing the Attorney General to expand the amount of time people could go on home confinement from federal prison. Normally you get 10% or 6 months of the end of your sentence, whichever is less. It's a very small period at the end of your sentence, but because they wanted to mitigate the spread of COVID and keep vulnerable people out of prison, they gave the Attorney General authority to give people more home confinement. And the Attorney General put forth some criteria: had to serve 50% of your sentence, no shots in the last year, low risk. And so they started letting people out. And we don't know exactly how many people got CARES Act home confinement, but over the past 14 months, about 25,000 people have gotten out. Right now, there's 7,400 people home, and of those, 4,500 people are serving longer home confinement terms than they would have got if CARES didn't pass. Our goal was going to say to the Biden administration, try to get these people off home confinement, because some of these people have 10 years, 5 years. They don't need to be on an ankle bracelet that long if they haven't screwed up. But what happened was on January 15th, at the very end of the Trump administration, the Justice Department, in response to a request from the Bureau of Prisons, said, can we bring some people back if they need more programming? Some of these people are home for a long period of time. And the Justice Department said, not only can you have to, and you have to bring all of them back, which was a shock to everybody. It was a shock to lawmakers who didn't say anything about this. And so that memo has been in place, and the administration has come in. We're now 100 days into the administration. We're trying to get them to either overrule that memo or rescind that memo. For people who don't know, this isn't just a normal memo that like administration might just put out. When the Office of Legal Counsel says something, that's usually considered the government's attorneys, that's their best considered view, so it's a little harder. But we have a situation where 4,500 people who were told they were going home to stay, who have reunited with their families, some have started college. I mean, I've talked to a bunch of them. You know, guy has a 10 and 12-year-old kid. Dad, are you going to have to go back? No, he promised them because the government promised him he was going to be able to go home. And now they're all have this cloud over their head. And so we're all, and with your help, Jason, trying to get the Justice Department to do the right thing, to avoid them having to come home. Every day that goes by is they get more and more anxious. The Bureau of Prisons thinks if they keep extending the sort of emergency period, you know, that's okay because now it's not imminent. But for these people, it's 3 more months with this cloud over their head. They see the government opening up, they see the prisons opening up, and they're worried they're going to have to go back. So we're trying to get some resolution on this. Like I said, the Justice Department is aware of it. They just had some of their more senior officials confirmed. So we're hoping to get some resolution of this quickly for the sake of these 4,500 people.
Inimai, Aamra, do you want to add anything to what Kevin said? Because I know this has been important for each of our organizations.
Yeah, I would just add that, you know, we've been very frustrated with the administration's lack of movement on this. We've been, you know, very happy with what they've done on other issues in criminal justice, and it's already May, and they've left this on the books for so many months. And allowing this to stay, I mean, getting rid of this memo is probably one of the easier executive actions that they could do. And there's a huge bipartisan support for taking such an action too. And so, I mean, I would just say, like, we've been very frustrated, and now that they do have more senior officials confirmed at DOJ, we're hopeful that we'll get some movement. You know, people talk about the 1994 crime bill and what that did to the federal prison population. If this memo stays on the books, you're looking at thousands of people coming back to federal prison and a huge explosion in the federal prison population under President Biden. So, you know, we really do encourage them. They have absolute authority to be able to do this, whether it's through executive action, whether it's through DOJ issuing some other kind of memo from the top, or whether it's OLC reconsidering and reversing its opinion. So we are hopeful, and we will continue to push until the effects of this are reversed.
Aamra, would you like to add anything?
Well, I, you know, just agree with my fellow panelists and the frustration that they have expressed. I think we all thought that this would be a no-brainer for the Biden administration once we learned about this memo that the Trump administration issued in its final days. It is a legal memo from DOJ attorneys, and that carries weight, but its reasoning is not 100% sound. When Congress passed the CARES Act, it was clear that it was expanding the BOP's home confinement authority. It didn't say anything about sending these individuals back. If Congress had wanted to make it clear that these individuals would be sent back, then it could have used another term like furlough, which has a different meaning and would apply to a situation where individuals are released briefly and then sent back to prison. But I think it sends a really, really dangerous and cruel message to these thousands of individuals who have returned to society. They have rekindled family connections. They are working, they're paying taxes. As Kevin mentioned, maybe going to college, they're rebuilding their lives, they're doing everything that we've asked of them. And the right thing to do is to find some way, and there are many ways that Inimai enumerated, to make sure that the right thing can be done and they can continue to be law-abiding citizens.
Jason, let me just say, one reason this is so horrifying is because we're all trying to figure out what this administration is going to do on criminal justice. I mean, Attorney General Garland, when he testified in his confirmation hearing, said he supported the Equal Act, so that was encouraging. They've rescinded the Sessions charging memo. They've done some good things. But, you know, Aamra's group at ACLU is seeking 25,000, federal commutations. You know, others are pushing for him to use his clemency authority. Here's 4,500 people that Bill Barr and Donald Trump said were so low risk that they were willing to use their authority to send them home. Bill Barr, who wrote the book on, you know, the case for more prisons, he put his name on sending these people home. They've been home 6 months, a year, no problems. To bring them back, how could you find a better group of people to give clemency to or give relief to than these people who've already proven they don't need any further incarceration? Like, it will be horrifying. I will be scared to death to think what kind of relief we might get if these people can't stay home.
Yeah. Yeah. Getting back to the episode, because there were a couple of learning moments for me in watching this episode. Krasner talks about data. And in this episode, one police captain dismisses data, saying that he doesn't go to meetings with numbers. And during the community meeting scene at the end, you see others mocking or dismissing Krasner's science and data. There's a ton of data in the criminal justice field showing that our reform efforts work and do not lead to an increase in crime. And in fact, it does the opposite. But that doesn't seem to be persuading many in the public or many actors inside the criminal system itself, such as judges, prosecutors, probation officers, prison officials, law enforcement, and the like. So the question, I guess, for the three of you is, how can we better communicate the data, the science, and the successes of reform-minded policies in a way that people can accept and even embrace? And Aamra, we'll start with you.
Sure. Well, yes, it's very challenging, I think, to educate people based on data and research. It can be hard to capture the public's attention with numbers. But something that's reassuring is that one thing we've learned from videos that have captured the brutal police murder of George Floyd and other police killings of Black people is that the public does want to learn about injustices in our system. There is an appetite for knowledge. And when the public is presented with the evidence, they can be motivated to push for change. And as much as we should advocate for change based on data and science, we should also try to humanize that data and science with the power of storytelling. I think that this docuseries does a wonderful job of doing that. It talks about the young woman, Latanya, I'm sorry, I'm butchering her name. I can't remember her name. The young woman who went to prison at the age of 13 and gets a job at the public defender office. Her story is a very compelling story about court supervision and how court supervision and those restrictions can be overly burdensome and unnecessary. And that's just an example of storytelling to illustrate something that we know for sure based on research and evidence. I know that Kevin's organization has done a wonderful job of using storytelling to illustrate problems in the criminal justice system.
Sorry, since Aamra mentioned you, Kevin, and certainly FAMM does have a ton of stories on this website. What do you think?
Yeah, you know, when I went to FAMM, you know, I was a policy guy on the Hill and I hated it. You know, I thought, oh, you know, let's give me the one pager and the policy and stuff. But that's just not the way people change their mind. I mean, the more social psychology I read, you realize people move by intuition and emotion, and then they use their brain as sort of backfill the reasons why they do it. I mean, if you take a guy like Mike Lee at the federal level, who you're close to, who's a libertarian on this, I mean, I think he thinks these sentences are unfair. And then when he has to describe it, he'll talk about cost savings or the Constitution stuff. But at a gut level, he just knows this is unfair. And so I do think that's what storytelling does. I mean, you can tell I can give you all the recidivism data, you know, all that sort of stuff. And I don't think people, their minds change. And it's just the way humans are. Now, I think what data can do, though, is show you that these stories you tell are not outliers, because the other side uses stories as anecdotes to say, you know, this happened, this one person got out and they did this. So, you know, the Willie Horton thing. And you want to be able to say, okay, but that was 1%. And so let's weigh the cost and benefit of that. So I think you want stories that are illustrative, and you want the data too. But I also think that our own side is got a love-hate relationship with data. I mean, when we find out sometimes that our favorite solutions don't, you know, the studies don't back it up, all of a sudden we talk about lived experience. So, you know, it's like, I don't think anyone is a purist on science. And so when people throw out, oh, this is just science, I mean, I don't think anyone's perfect on that. I think it's helpful to have data on your side. But I think at the end of the day, all the great social justice movements of the last 50 years have been when people saw other people as human beings who they could relate to, and they decided they should be treated differently. And that's what I think storytelling can do and data can.
Inimai?
Yeah, I completely agree with what Kevin and Aamra have said. I do think that you need to really personalize the data through storytelling. So I mean, I was actually just gonna say the exact same thing. The one thing I will add, I do think that the data is penetrating somewhat. We did a really large study when I was at the Brennan Center around showing that the increase in incarceration did not contribute to the massive decline in crime since the 90s. And I think that data like that has started to permeate the public consciousness and the political consciousness. So, and I think that advocates have done a very good job coupling that kind of research with storytelling coming out of other advocacy groups too.
What I work on for the Due Process Institute largely are procedural reforms aimed at, 1, decreasing the number of people who are incarcerated, 2, decreasing how long they are incarcerated for, and 3, better support systems for when they are incarcerated or when they return to our neighborhoods. One of our key concerns is the number of people who are incarcerated prior to them ever being convicted or prior to them even admitting guilt. This is referred to as pretrial detention. It's essentially locking people away in a negative, predatory environment, away from their families, their jobs, their school, and support services in the real world, before the system has ever even decided whether or not this person has committed a crime, whether they are in fact guilty or not. And also before the system has had a thoughtful chance to decide whether incarceration, rather than some other option, is the best answer for the situation. So one of our priority federal reforms is something called the Smarter Pretrial Detention for Drug Charges Act, which would end the presumption of pretrial detention for federal drug defendants. Obviously, a judge would still be able to hold someone in jail who they deemed or determined to be a danger or a flight risk, but the legal presumption that exists in federal law now tells the judge that they should presumptively incarcerate drug defendants, and we believe that should end in our view. Do you think this reform is a good policy? And I think we'll start here with Inimai.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I do think it's good policy. Speaking of unfairness, and I think that the presumption of pretrial detention is probably one of the most unfair things in the criminal justice system, because you have people who have not yet been convicted, who haven't seen their day in court, already being incarcerated. And, you know, there is a ton of data that shows people who are incarcerated pre-trial end up pleading out and getting higher sentences than people who are released pre-trial. So that leads to worse outcomes there too. And there are so many other ways that you can address this issue. I mean, the idea of doing pretrial supervision or home confinement, or there's just a ton of different options, rather than just sending someone to jail for, you know, however many weeks, months, years it takes them to process through the system. So yeah, I mean, we absolutely think that that piece of legislation is a really good reform.
So the statute itself says that any drug that is, or drug offense that is 10 years or more, which is the vast majority of federal drug crime. So we were talking about things like marijuana, crack cocaine, which obviously for a certain quantity can trigger a very long sentence. Aamra, I know you work on a wide range of legal reform issues, criminal justice reform issues. You would agree with Inimai that this policy is this piece of legislation is something that needs to be passed, and not just passed yesterday. It's something that we should all be vigorously fighting for. Yeah, correct?
I do. This is a bill that the ACLU supports, but you know who else supports reform of our pretrial presumption standards, particularly with drugs, is the federal bench, the federal judiciary. Since 2017, the Judicial Conference of the United States, which is the policy-making group for federal judges, has been writing to Congress and asking Congress to eliminate the presumption in presumption of detention in drug cases. They don't want to be restrained by these presumptions. They want the freedom and the discretion to consider the facts of the case and make decisions based on the individual circumstances of the case. So Congress has a lot of support here. Unlike Larry Krasner, who's running into trouble on other reforms with actors in the Philadelphia system, at least on this issue of a presumption of detention for drug cases in the federal system, the judges are in agreement. I also think it's worth noting that similar to mandatory minimum sentences, which Congress intended to apply to the worst of the worst, same thing with the presumption of detention in drug cases. Congress intended that they apply to the worst of the worst, but in practice, they apply to everyone. They apply to 93% of drug cases. And those are not just addicts, but also people who, like Kevin said, are trying to make some money. They're street level dealers, they're couriers, but again, really low level offenders. These aren't big ballers. These are guys who I represented for years and my office represented because they were indigent. They couldn't afford to hire their own counsel. And I don't think that's what Congress ever intended. I agree, it's past time to fix that.
Kevin, would you like to add anything here?
I don't really have anything smart to say about this. They already said everything, but first of all, I didn't know Aamra was going to say big ballers. So what qualifies, what's the threshold for big baller? I don't know, but I'll just say, she brought up one point that I think most people wouldn't know just about how the criminal justice system works, because I was struck by this when I was testifying against mandatory minimums in Pennsylvania. Their court struck them down in 2005, and then they've been trying to reinstate them, and I testified against it. And I said, you got to have a couple judges testify, and the judges are always concerned about testifying because they say, we don't make policy and all this. And Aamra brought up that the Judicial Conference weighed in on this pretrial detention. It is crazy that we have a system where prosecutors lobby. They have at the federal level, the National Association of Assistant U.S. Attorneys, who's up there very aggressive, lobbying for prosecutors' interests, like everything from pensions to mandatory minimums, which make their job easier. And then judges, by and large, stay out of it. And they have so much to tell us about how the system runs that I think we need to change that. I think we should be seeking their views on more things, not on necessarily bills, specific bills, or getting into the weeds of policy. But they know how the courts are working. I remember when Justice Scalia testified before Congress, it was just a free-ranging hearing. And they asked him, why do you think the quality of the federal bench is poorer? And part of it was pay. But he also said the drug war. He said people don't want to come and just be sort of bureaucrats who just give out sentences based on, they came to do trials. They came to do important work. And instead they're just, what is the mandatory minimum for this? And just accepting plea deals. I just think judges have a lot to tell us. And so I just was interested that Aamra said that about that bill. I just think we should be consulting them more to have, not to give them all the weight, but they're an important actor in the system.
So stakeholders is appreciate you mentioning in both Aamra and Kevin talking about that, because stakeholders are something that comes up in the episode to a large degree. And Councilwoman Sánchez in the episode referred to Krasner's work as being generational, for which the results may not be seen for 10 years, while also acknowledging that what people want is that to see these problems addressed right now. Obviously, buy-in from stakeholders is key to moving anything in a new direction. What are the steps that criminal justice reformers can take to get that buy-in, or at least try to get it, from the public, from the people whose immediate thought is, I want to feel safe now, or I want drugs out of my community now, or I want to end violence in my community now? And I'll start here with Inimai.
Yeah, so I would say, I think that when you are trying to make big change, it is hard, and it's very important to make sure that you're bringing people along with you. I think that some of what we saw in the episode was Krasner not necessarily meeting people where they were to bring them along, but rather kind of just out of the gate talking about data and science and what he wants to do. So I think that, you know, when you're coming in and you're trying to change the entire system, I do think it's important to find out what people want, what their problems are, and before telling them what you want to do. So I think that's one thing I'd add there. And you also saw in the episode that the councilwoman suggests to Krasner that he go on one of the ride-alongs. I think something like that would be very good as well, where that's where he can actually see what's going on himself and be a little bit more attuned and a little bit more empathetic to not only police officers, but also the community, right? Because even though that he's right on the science and data, people want to see change in what's going on in their neighborhoods, not just something that's like a theoretical research study.
Kevin?
I agree with that. Especially with the empathy thing. I do think, you know, we had a campaign about visiting prison because we thought lawmakers should come, not just to see conditions, but to see the people who are serving, especially in federal prison. There's this idea, Jeff Sessions used to say, these are the worst of the worst, right? And in federal prisons, it's really not the worst of the worst because half of them are in there for drugs, 40,000 people in camps that have no walls or fences around them, like I was in. These are not the worst people. And so, you know, I think there's value in doing that. And I totally agree with Inimai, but, you know, do a ride along. Like everybody who's for defund the police, get in a cop's shoes for a day. I mean, we need to understand each other's roles. I feel the same way about corrections officers. There were ones I loved and there's ones I hated, but it's not a great job. And yet, you know, so put yourself in their shoes. I think we'd get to a better place. I think the challenge about this whole generational thing versus immediate results is lawmakers are up every 2 years, right? I mean, 2 or 4 years or 6 years. And they can't say, oh, this is going to play out down the road. I mean, they have to show the results now. And we're all in that system too. We push reforms. And then if, you know, we say, oh, well, our reform passed and crime continued to fall as if there was some connection. When we know that there's so many factors at play that, you know, we're not fine tuning the system with these dials of like, we do a little bit here and then the system changes. And so it's hard to have humility because you want to say my solutions will work. And yet, there's so many things that could be happening, right? Krasner has drastically reduced the supervised population. He's reducing incarceration, but he's got a crime spike. He's got 500 murders in Philadelphia last year, and they'll have more this year. But that's happening in other cities. So how much of that is what he's doing, right? So it gets so hard to tease these things out. And the problem is that in a democracy where you have frequent elections, people feel like they need something. So one thing I would say is, I wish that with some of our solutions, especially as it relates to reducing incarceration, we could find the resources to do both and instead of or. You know, we talk about we want to reduce incarceration, so let's invest in early childhood education or lead abatement. But we can't do those things instead of these other things. I mean, we still have to do triage with a spiking shooting rate and murder rate. We've still got to address that. But I think it is smart to like try other things and stand those things up and point and show how they work better and could take the place of some of these carceral solutions.
And Aamra, I'll give you a chance to respond here as well.
I think you have total agreement on the panel, from the panel, Jason. I think that, as Inimai suggested, it would have been nice to see Larry Krasner do some ride-alongs meet with captains and really do outreach, because he's not just representing people in the streets and people who are incarcerated or under supervision. He's also working within a government structure that includes these important stakeholders.
So in several of the past episodes of Philly DA, the question of recidivism has come up. And I know this is a constant theme in a lot of the work the four of us do. There's a general theme in this docuseries about whether once someone has committed a criminal offense, if the best answer isn't just to, quote, lock them up and throw away the key, because that way they can never reoffend. There have been a lot of scenes throughout the series that show how scared the public is about providing folks a second chance. Several of us on this panel this evening are, in fact, supportive of a number of second chance or second look reform. Let's explain, one, what those reforms would do, and two, why we think those approaches are actually more in the interest of public safety than just locking people up and throwing away the key. Aamra, I'll start with you, because I know your ACLU is working on a few of these pieces of legislation.
So I can speak to what we're doing at the federal level. We are supportive of Cory Booker's second look bill. And, you know, just going back though to the larger question of giving people second chances, you know, it's really a question of society's values. And do we really want to have a system where we warehouse people who have served an extended prison sentence and maybe have presented evidence, or can, if given the opportunity, present evidence to the court that it would be safe to return them to society, that they could be law-abiding and also be productive and contribute? But going back to Senator Booker's Second Look Act, it presents really a very responsible and careful way to consider people for release. I think it's important to talk about what the bill actually does. It does not open the floodgates. It merely allows people to file a motion with the court. And they have to first serve 10 years of their sentence. And there are lots of hurdles for them to overcome. First of all, they're appearing in front of the judge who was the judge who sentenced them. So imagine having to go back to the judge who originally imposed whatever the sentence was, 20 years, 50 years, and saying to them, no, I've changed. I know you know my case, and I know you decided this was the right sentence for me, but I'm asking you to reconsider it. So you're not going, you know, in most cases, you're not going to be going to a new judge. You're going to be going to the original sentencing judge who already knows your case and already made a decision. Federal prosecutors get to participate in this process. They get to fully brief the court, and they're actually directed by this bill, should it become law, they would be directed to conduct a particularized review of the facts and the case. So they're asked to look closely. Victims get to weigh in. They would be notified, and they would get to be heard. So it's, you know, a very careful, responsible process that's laid out in that bill, and I'm sure other bills that have gained momentum at the state level. I just want to point out why something like Second Look is so important at the federal level, and that's because parole was abolished in the 1980s in the federal system. Every time a person in federal court pleads guilty, the judge tells them, just keep in mind, you're going to be serving your entire sentence, whatever sentence I impose on you when we get to sentencing, because parole has been abolished. And so people serve their entire sentence. There is no way out if they have rehabilitated themselves. And we have studies now that show us that people age out of crime, and they're less likely to recidivate as they get older. And this presents a way to, a responsible way to potentially reduce the prison population and address some of those concerns.
Inimai, I know the Justice Action Network has a few different pieces of legislation that you're working on. I know we're also working on some of the same bills as it relates to Second Chance Initiative. So tell us what the Justice Action Network is working on as it relates to Second Chance legislation.
Yeah, so one of the main reforms that we are working on is the Clean Slate Act. So that was actually just introduced in the House and the Senate last week. So it's the first effort to, at the federal level, to establish a record sealing process for certain convictions. I think this reform is particularly important. I think generally speaking, the way that the system works, people come out of prison and there are not appropriate reentry services to make sure that they are able to get jobs, to make sure that they are able to get housing. But then the stigma of a criminal record follows them around for their entire life. So I think the Clean Slate Act is one really good step there, and also very bipartisan, to be able to at least allow for sealing in certain cases so that people don't have to worry about having such a stigma. Another bill that we worked on was the Fair Chance to Compete for Jobs Act. So we were able to get that across the finish line in 2019. That would ban the box on employment applications for the federal government and federal contractor. So, you know, another small step to make sure that people can get back on their feet and get a second chance when they exit prison.
Before I weigh in here, Kevin, I want to give you a chance to mention anything. I'm not sure if FAMM is working on anything, given that predominantly folks at FAMM work on sentencing issues and OLC issues, administrative issues. Is there anything you're tracking or following on the Hill that as it relates to second chance?
Yeah, we were. We helped Senator Booker a couple of years ago put together the second look bill, and we have second look bills moving in a couple states. Illinois right now has a 20-year second look. DC passed a 15-year second look that is the gold standard. I just want to say about this, Jason, because you mentioned recidivism when you opened. This is such a test for us, sort of like the movement attacking. You know, we have mass incarceration because we have these extreme sentences. It's not just we send a lot of people to prison, but it's because we send them for so long. In Pennsylvania, there's 5,300 people serving life sentences. And so the issue is, when we think about recidivism, we think low-level drug offender, oh, that person, they screwed up. Well, that person's actually more likely to recidivate than the 50 or 60-year-old who might have done something worse, but has served 15 or 20 years. Keeping that person in prison is for retribution. That's because we're mad at them. But if public safety were our guide, we'd revisit those sentences. So we're really working hard on second look, both at the federal level. We've done that with compassionate release, and we're working on that at the state level, because that to us is the answer. We need as many system actors to have as many mechanisms as possible to review these long sentences. So the Booker bill and others set up, ways for the court to review sentences. What Krasner and other prosecutors are doing are setting up sentence review units. They're revisiting sentences that are long and going into court and sometimes seeking shorter sentences. But that's going to be the big challenge for us. If we care about public safety, we're not going to keep locking up 70 and 80-year-olds. We're not going to make people die in prison. That doesn't make us safer. And yet they've usually committed crimes that we all find heinous. And so we have a hard time thinking about giving them a second chance. But so to me, that's where the big fight is going to come, is how do we deal with people who have committed serious crimes, but are well past the point? Because to every time we say people age out of crime, the converse is true. Young people commit more crime. And so if we focus all of our second chances on young people, well, we know those are the people more likely to recidivate. And so what I'd like to see us focus on a little bit is these extreme sentences and the fact that people can change, and that it's not in our interest to keep locking people up and turning our prisons into nursing homes.
Yeah. I'll add just a couple more pieces of legislation more along the second chance line. One is the Kenneth P. Thompson Begin Again Act, which has been reintroduced in the House. Currently under federal law, someone can have their simple possession drug offense expunged provided they're under the age of 21. The Kenneth P. Thompson Begin Again Act would eliminate the age restriction and make it available to all ages. So anyone with a simple possession conviction can have that record expunged. And then a bill that I'm hoping will be reintroduced soon is called the Ed Access Act, which eliminates the prohibition for the American Opportunity Tax Credit, which is essentially a college tax credit for individuals with a drug offense. Unfortunately, that law stems from my home state of Georgia. It was enacted in the 1990s, modeled after what Georgia had done, and it essentially locks potential people out of getting that tax credit when they want to go to college. So that's something I'm hoping to see reintroduced relatively soon. But the second look legislation is something that I know Shannon and I are talking about a lot as a potential thing that the Due Process Institute wants to get involved in. So we're looking at that for sure. And it certainly seems Senator Booker, is his passion for these issues speaks to the type of legislation he's introducing. And second look is certainly an innovative approach to it. And I'm hoping to see more, both more action on that at the federal level, as well as some more action on it at the state level. Got a couple more questions before we wrap up here. In some ways, those of us working on the federal level are also trying to change the behavior of politicians. I think we've acknowledged that to some degree tonight. Has what Krasner gone through reminded you in any way of your own work at the federal level? Are the challenges the same, or are they different? And I'll start with Inimai.
I think the challenges are similar. I would say, at the federal level, there are definitely some people who are very against reform. I mean, there's a minority of folks who I just think might never get on board with things. But I do think that at the federal level, both Republicans and Democrats are aware of the issue. I do think that they generally support reform. To me, the issue at the federal level more seems to be that other non-criminal justice issues end up rising to be these huge priorities and kind of suck up the air out of the room. And so it's a little bit harder to get the momentum. But I do think that, one good thing is that we do have broad support. So I think there's some similarities, but some differences too.
Gavin?
Yeah, it's so hard because I came from the other side of this. When I was on this hill, I was more on the tough on crime side, not because I had thought about these issues a lot, but just that was sort of ideological commitment I had. And I think with criminal justice, it's such a visceral issue, right? Nobody has a gut on net neutrality or like, what's the optimum amount of NASA spending, right? Like, it's just like, you don't have that. But our personalities sort of drive what we think works for law and order. To look at how you raise your kids, how your parents were. Like, we have a sense of like, discipline works, right? What do you call it? What's it, like one chance or one strike and you're out? What's that? No. I can't remember that. What's it, like no risk? What's the no policy?
No tolerance, zero.
Yeah,
tolerance?
something like that. Zero tolerance, right? So like we all have the sense. We all have the sense of like what works, and so I think that's how most lawmakers are. I mean, they think they have a gut about what keeps us safe, and it may be, it's just more enforcement, and for others it's like, no, it's probably more treatment. And a lot of these things are not always, you're not always able to reach them with the arguments that we want to bring to them. So it really makes it hard. I think Inimai's right. There's some people you don't want to write off anybody, but there's some people, I mean, Tom Cotton, I mean, we're not going to do anything with him. And there's others too who think they know, right? I've been disappointed with other people who, I thought they'd be open to it, but they think they know, and then they think the politics still are such that, they don't have to do it. That there's no cost to not being for reform, right? They're not worried about it being a third rail, but they don't feel like they have to support reform. So it's really hard because I think some other issues you could really, you might be able to convince people with other things about good and bad policy, but crime is one I think everyone thinks they have a intuitive sense of what's the right thing. I think that's what makes our job so challenging.
I should have said at the beginning of the question, naming names probably not the best idea, but you mentioned that one person who to this day, every time I hear him talk about criminal justice reform, it makes me want to pull my hair out. And he's not the only one at this point, but certainly there are other members who people I thought were going to be good on an issue who turned out to be absolutely terrible. So, Aamra.
So I think that at the federal level, we encounter much of the same problems that we see in this docuseries Kramer encountering. But I think, the layer on top of that is something that Inimai and Kevin have touched upon, and it's this really deep partisanship that that just seems stronger than ever the last few years, so that Republicans who supported initially the old Smarter Sentencing Act a few years ago and then supported the First Step Act, I don't know if they're going to embrace the same policies that they supported a few years ago at this time when there's a Democrat in the White House. I don't know that that's going to happen. I'm hopeful that they will follow the policy and not the politics. But bills like the Justice Safety Valve Act were introduced in the Senate for several Congresses by a Republican and a Democrat. And I just don't know if that will happen this Congress, but we're hopeful it can happen. And that was a bill that would have made it possible for judges to disregard mandatory minimums in any cases. So I think that there are people on both sides who believe in the policy, but the politics get in the way. And that's something that I think is a little different from what Krasner is dealing with, because he's dealing with true believers on both sides.
Aamra, do you think this is though? I think that's true. And I think, with Trump in the White House, you had this Nixon goes to China effect on criminal justice, where if he would do it, right, everybody else could be for it. You had all the cover in the world. Biden doesn't provide that cover, and so it's getting politicized. But it's also defund the police. It's bail reform and how it's working in some of these cities, right? So I think the right is a little nervous. I think the left is going further left, and the right is shrinking back to where it was. And so that's where I think I agree with you. Both sides are being partisan, but I also think there is a fear that for Republicans, criminal justice reform now is conflated with defunding the police and, cash bail, which they're not all the way there on yet. And so I think the problem is on both sides of not wanting to work together as much as they did, because they're not going to the middle. They're both moving to opposite solutions right now. I mean, that's my fear, is if it, is that there's other things that have happened that have made the politics worse for us.
If you watch, and I don't want to, because I have one more question left, and Shana's going to lead us out of this, but I think anybody who watches the House Judiciary Committee and some of the hearings we've seen, to see some of the folks who not just I know, but have been friends with over the years, politicize issues that frankly shouldn't be politicized. It's really frustrating, I think, for all of us, because it's all about the future. It's all about the next cycle, and that's no way. Grasping for power is not a way to handle these issues. You have to look at them in a responsible way, and I see too few members, particularly on the House side, doing that right now, and it's incredibly frustrating. But real fast, before I turn this back over to Shana to lead us out, and again, real quick, what was the standout moment or scene from this episode for you, and why? And let's start with Aamra.
Oh, from this episode, for me, I think it was toward the end when Larry Krasner had to go back to a town hall, go back to a group of people for a second town hall after he, I think, was a little bit arrogant in responding to their questions and their criticisms, and actually looked them in the face and respectfully explained his policy. I think that was a relief and an exciting moment, because that needs to happen.
Kevin?
100% agree. Just when he said, I have to listen more. And I think we all have to listen more. I think we have to hear where people are coming from. I mean, we have a Black lawmaker from Philadelphia who just introduced new mandatory minimums for gun crimes in Philadelphia because of the murder spike. And people are saying, well, you know, it's so stupid, mandatory minimums don't work. But he's a freshman member. His district's on fire. And he's hearing from his community members. Now, I don't think it's the right solution, but the answer is not just say, oh, the science is that you're wrong. He's going to community meetings where his people are saying, do something, lock these people up. We know who they are. So I think we have to explain more. I think Krasner actually is a great explainer. I think he knows the stuff really well. And when he does engage and give people the respect that, you know, to bring them along. So I really like that part too.
Inimai?
Yeah, so from this episode, I would say, so there's the interdepartmental meeting with the public health department, and someone says, people aren't using drugs anymore to get high, they're doing it so they don't feel sick. With the money we lose in the justice system, we might be better off sending them to the Four Seasons for a year and getting them sober. I just think that that perfectly captures the problem and how it can't be solved with the justice system response.
So I'll go with my favorite moment real fast. Mine was when Krasner was at that first town hall event, and he started going after law enforcement. Basically, first he said that he was misleading them, and then finally he said they're lying to you, and he said they were lying to you twice. And I can think about so many times during the course of First Step Act, which was the piece of legislation we all worked on that we got across the finish line, how many times I accused a politician or a staffer of lying. And I'm looking back on it and thinking, was that the most productive thing I could have said? And you get caught in the moment, you get passionate, and you're looking back on it, I wish I'd done a couple things differently here and there, including one particular moment where I got into a heated argument with a leadership staffer, and there were a lot of expletives hurled during that conversation. But I think the one thing that I think we've all taken from not just the episode and telling stories, it's humanizing, not just humanizing the data, about humanizing the stories of people who have been inside the walls of a prison, but also even to some degree humanizing the opposition as well. Because there are bad actors, certainly, and Kevin mentioned one of them who is a bad actor, but there are people who I think they're mostly ill-informed, and they have to be educated, and we have to humanize them when we're approaching them, trying to get them educated. So that's something I've been really bad about, but I think in this political environment right now, I've been spending a lot of my time trying to humanize people and post January 6th and so on. So I think that's something that I've learned from not just this panel, which has been great, and thank you to each of you, but also throughout the course of Philly DA. So again, thank you to the three of you. I really appreciate you guys doing this this evening. And Shanna, I will kick it back over to you.
And that, boys and girls at home, is why I said in my intro that Jason is learning to be a diplomat. He is still on that journey, and we appreciate every step he takes on that journey. So thanks to each of you, all of our panelists, from the bottom of my heart for joining us this evening. I am incredibly grateful to each of you for sharing your evening with us. And I'd also like to thank our viewers for spending their Sunday night with us as well. Please visit our website, clause40.org, to register for next week's episode and panel, where Jonathan Blanks, formerly of Cato Institute and now contributing editor at the Clause 40 Foundation, moderates a discussion with Jamila Hodge from the Vera Institute of Justice, Jonathan M. Smith, executive director of Washington Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights and Urban Affairs and former chief of the Special Litigation Section of the Civil Rights Division of DOJ, and Patrice Sultan, founder and executive director of DC Justice Lab, as they discuss how to transform our responses to police misconduct and brutality. Until then, take care, everybody.